All right, welcome to Plan9Crunch. We're doing a podcast. I'm Doug Gibson, and we are with Joe Blevins, who is Mr. I shouldn't say Mr., but has the best Ed Wood blog out there. It's Dead to
Oh,
Rights,
thank you.
Ed Wood Wednesdays. Look, I got to tell you something. I have to read every one, and I've reread most of those sometimes. But Joe does more than that. He also does a podcast on Happy Days, right?
I do.
Yeah, and I didn't know from I listened to those podcasts. I wasn't a huge fan. I
Thank you.
never knew there was cartoons for Happy Days.
Yeah, we're making our way through the animated series right now.
Yeah,
It's just because I couldn't let the Happy Days podcast go. We did 11 seasons of Happy Days and 255 episodes of it we reviewed, and I still wasn't done. And so I said to my co-host, "Would you mind going through the animated series?" And so we're doing that. And so now we're getting episodes where Fonzie gets to meet with Cleopatra.
yes,
He's
I
a
watched that, or I watched or listen. I can't. I guess watch, listen to it or something. All right.
watch, listen to it. You
Yeah,
can. It's on YouTube if you want it.
yeah. I
We don't.
saw it on YouTube. I think I listened to yours. You also. I want to say that you also. I was about to say tweet, but you're on X a lot. Okay. And what you do
Yeah.
is on Friday nights, and I really enjoy this, and people should listen to Joe Blevins at X because you do B Movie Maniacs on Friday,
Yes.
a movie, and then sometimes you do the Three Stooges on Saturday, but then
Sometimes a little
you
bit.
do Svengoolie. And
Yeah. I
yeah, go ahead. I love your Svengoolie stuff on there.
Thank you. I basically do. I what used to be called live tweeting. That's basically offering a running commentary on the film. And I have a little system that I work with now where I have the movie playing in one window and I have Twitter, or now X, running in another window, so I can screenshot the movie as I go along.
So that's how you do that. Okay, that's
So
cool.
I can offer screenshots of the film that I'm talking about, because a lot of times what I want to talk about is uh, how the characters look, or what's happening in the background, or and all kinds of things like that. So um, one of the trickiest parts was last night's B Movie Maniacs movie. I think was the second of the Godzilla films. It was called Godzilla Raids
Rage
Again.
again. Yeah.
And when I am screenshotting stuff and thinking of what to say about it, I'm not actually watching the movie for a few seconds. I'm kind of looking away to do something else. And the version of Godzilla Raids Again that they used was the original one in Japanese. It wasn't the dubbed version, and I don't speak Japanese. So if I'm not looking at the screen and the characters are talking, I have no idea what
What's going
there's
on?
I have no idea what's going on. So fortunately, uh, Godzilla movies are not difficult to follow in any sense. Godzilla exists. He's giant. He's crushing cities. Government and military guys are meeting often around big, long tables, and they're sitting through
Yeah.
slideshows and stuff about what they're going to do about the monster.
I gotta say something. My son Joe is like the kaiju expert in this family. So
Okay.
if you sit down and talk, and you'll see him later, Godzilla with him or Gamera, he'll talk your ear off for 2 hours. All the
Well,
nuances, the minutia.
well, some people are. In my lifetime, I've sat through, because of Mystery Science Theater 3000, Svengoolie, and B Movie Maniacs. I've sat through a lot of giant monster movies, and so um, I just notice all like the tropes and cliches of them. The crowds running, from place to place. The cops and military people in Japan with the white gloves. I always am commenting on the white gloves because that is just such it's so unusual to our eyes, from America, is that our military guys and cops don't go around with the white gloves all the time. And they've commented on this on Mystery Science Theater 3000, the trope of like the little kids in short pants who are somehow
Yeah.
like closer to the monster than everyone else, and they have like special access to everything, and then they're like pushed to the front of the line. because they know more about Mothra or Gamera or Godzilla than anyone
You know,
else.
my son did a paper that was at the National Undergraduate Literary Conference on Gamera versus Gyrion and stuff, and how those little kids have a bond with the monster. I just,
Yeah,
but it comes back to Ed Wood now. I
sure.
I'm obsessed with the Ed Wood minutia. I think you are too. All right.
I am.
And
Yeah,
so I want to ask you a question before we go into the book. The first
sure.
time I heard of Ed Wood, I think everyone's going to ask themselves that question. I was in eighth grade and I was doing
Okay.
a book report on Bela Lugosi, and so
Oh,
I checked out. Yeah, I love Lugosi from
yeah, I do
birth.
too.
Okay, so I checked out the Kramer book and the Lenig book,
Yes.
and there was this thing about Ed Wood at the back in these
Right.
movies. And I was just fascinated by that, although I'd never seen any of them or anything. I think I
Oh,
might have seen on Channel 52 in
well,
Los
yeah.
Angeles, Glen or Glenda once, but I turned it because I
Okay.
didn't care at the
Wow.
time.
What a.
But anyways, I looked up Ed Wood's phone number, but I didn't call. I thought to
Okay.
my I thought to
Now,
myself, I have enough for this. I don't have to do this right before. Yeah.
now you mentioned that I watch a lot of times the Three Stooges on
Yeah.
Saturday afternoon, which I do. And there's a great story of the current TV host, Tom Bergeron,
Hmm.
of Dancing with the Stars. He was on Dancing with the Stars for many years, and I think America's Funniest Videos. He was such a nervy kid that he just decided on a whim to call up the surviving members of the Three Stooges
Oh, cool.
and uh, did interview them over the phone. And he wasn't connected at that point to any media whatsoever. He was just a kid who was calling them. And Larry at that point, I think, was in a nursing home and things like that. So, um, and then he called Mo. I think he called Mo and Larry. By that point, Shemp and Curly
They
had
had
died.
died. They had died.
They had died. So by that point, though, Larry and Mo were still alive, and so that was inspirational to me. That Tom Bergeron just would call up Mo and Larry just out of nowhere and call.
Well,
And
in this book, the Bible essentially, okay,
yes,
there's a
okay.
guy who calls up Ed Wood and it's an anonymous name, and Ed Wood
Well,
talks to him.
well, I did a whole article about somebody who's interviewed in Nightmare of Ecstasy, a guy named Scott Zimmerman,
Yes, that's who I'm talking about. I remember
and
reading that.
I wrote a whole article about Scott
Yeah,
because I just thought it was odd. It was like this guy who was like just I think a kid in Ohio
yeah.
who just was seeing Ed's movies on TV and just decided to call him up. And I think the author of that book, Rudolph Gray, I think regrets at the time that he did not decide to get in touch with Ed Wood. He didn't decide to, to call him up because he could have, because um, I'm not sure where Rudy Gray was living in the 1970s. I think he's a New Yorker.
He used to
Uh,
hang out with the guy that made that Basket Case movie and watch Ed Wood movies. I
oh
think.
yeah, Frank
Yeah,
Henenlotter.
Henenlotter.
Um, that's an interesting guy. He's always very funny and interesting in interviews. So I'd like to meet Frank someday if I could. Um, I would want to ask Frank Henenlotter what he thought of the Emma Stone movie from last year, Poor Things, because
Mm-hmm.
to me, Poor Things was like the art house version of Frank's film Frankenhooker,
I
which
hadn't thought of that, but that might be
there is
true. Yeah.
it's well, I really if people watching this haven't seen Poor Things, absolutely watch Poor Things um if you like Frankenstein movies and like takeoffs of the
Mm-hmm.
Frankenstein mythos, you're gonna love Poor Things. It's like, and I love when stuff like this happens, like this, and a few years ago, The Shape of Water, um, where this stuff that's really rooted in the old horror movies and sometimes what were even considered trash or B movies. If you do it with respected directors and respected actors, you can get great reviews and Oscars and all of this stuff. And I thought the supreme example of that is The Silence of the Lambs, which swept the Academy Awards.
Mm-hmm.
And I just rewatched the Silence of the Lambs not long ago, and it absolutely could have been marketed as like a grindhouse exploitation movie, in the 70s.
It's
It has all like the sensationalism and the violence
Well,
and
that's a
stuff.
whole other. That's another subject because I think about all these movies that were made in the Grindhouse era that the big budget things took over and made their own, like with
Yeah.
Halloween, and they put all these guys out of business essentially. Like
Well,
Barry Harry Novak, Barry Mahan.
yeah, I was just thinking about Barry Mahan. I was just watching a video about Barry Mahan uh, the other day. Well, I just thought it was kind of a miraculous thing. If you watch in Silence of the Lambs, there's even cameos by Roger Corman is like in the movie.
Yeah.
Charles Napier, who was in a lot of the B movies, was in the Russ Meyer movies, is kind of one of the main actors in the movie. And I'm watching this, I still enjoy it. And I was like, wow, this is the movie that like all the smart critics and all the respectable critics were like writing nice reviews about
Well, I
and
remember I
giving all
loved
these
it.
and
Wait,
giving these
isn't
Academy
Napier
Awards.
in that director's a lot of that director's films? The guy that made Planet.
Jonathan Demme, yeah.
Yeah, he's in almost all of his movies, I believe.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, Jonathan, he is Jonathan
Demi,
was
yeah.
Demme. Jonathan Demme was rooted in the B movies. I mean, I think he started working for Roger Corman. I think one of his first films was like Caged Heat. I think it was like like a women prison movie was like one of the first things he ever did. And what I love was just the miracle of this movie where I don't think he left his B movie roots behind at all. It's just, if you put Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins in the movie and now it's Academy Award stuff. And a few years ago, uh, The Shape of Water, which was kind of a riff on the Creature from the Black Lagoon
Yeah.
mythos. I think that won Best
I
Picture.
think it did too. So
And
go on, go on.
and just last year, Poor Things, it didn't win Best Picture. It was nominated for Best Picture, and Emma Stone won for Best Actress. And it was to me, it was very, very similar to Frankenhooker. And I also just rewatched another Frankenstein takeoff, which was Andy Warhol's Frankenstein or
I've seen that too.
Flesh for Frankenstein. And I was thinking, um, I guess if you put Andy Warhol's name on it, it also gets sort of like, more respect, or it gets sort of an artier reputation. But it really is just a fancier, artier version of just a grindhouse sort of B movie horror film, and it's got a ton of gore in it. Now, Poor Things doesn't have gore in it,
Mm-hmm.
but it still is very similar to. It's similar to. Well, at least the director of that film admits, like one of the films that he watched as a reference point, I think, was Young Frankenstein. So
Mm-hmm.
now the closest thing Ed Wood ever made, I guess, well, I guess, Ed Wood, the closest thing that he ever made to a Frankenstein or a mad scientist film, obviously, is Bride of the Monster. And I suppose Ed's touch of respectability came from the 1994 Tim Burton film, which again, it won a couple of Academy Awards.
Yeah, I
And
wanted to
so
ask you a question because Joe has a question when he gets here about Ed Wood, the
sure.
movie. Just really quickly before we get into the book, tell me was the first time you discovered Ed Wood?
The first time I discovered Ed Wood was not through his movies at all. It was through books. I read about Ed Wood long before I ever saw his movies. What happened was this was the late 1980s or so. I would have been, in junior high, early high school maybe. And what I would do is I'd go through the video guides, and the way to find what I wanted to know about the cool movies, the interesting movies back then, was I would go through and I'd try to find all the 0-star movies and the 1-star movies, because back then critics were pretty uptight and they didn't necessarily,
I missed those books, by the way.
I do too. I loved them.
Stephen Sure, Leonard Maltin. There was a
I
video one too, video movies.
yeah, there was the video movie guy. There
Yeah.
was Leonard Maltin would put out one every year. There was like several that would
I
come
think
out.
Stephen Sure did one for a while too, the LA Times.
Those were wonderful resources. And so in looking through those books, when I was a child, I knew that there were weird movies out there in the world, but I didn't know how to find them because cable TV was not much of a thing. Obviously, the internet and streaming did not exist at all. Um, you really had to rely on what was on television.
Hmm.
And my way of doing, finding the weird stuff often would be to stay up late and watch late night television. That would be sometimes where the weird movies would come out. But I knew if I could find these video guides and find all the 1-star and 0-star movies, Leonard Maltin inadvertently led me to a bunch of movies that he gave terrible reviews to. And that was how I found out about, really, it's how I found out about Russ Meyer, how I found out about Herschel Gordon Lewis, really how I found out about John Waters.
You just mentioned,
Um,
though, I was thinking John Waters.
those were all the things. That's how I found out about those guys. And that's
Yeah.
how I found out about Ed Wood as
Edward,
well.
I used to think, who is this Andy Milligan? I want to see one of his
Oh, Andy
films.
Milligan.
Yeah.
Well, again, I couldn't envision a time when, there would be Andy Milligan, whole series of DVDs and things that would come out and things.
I know.
But the real breakthrough. So in those books and those video guides, of course, they would just give like a paragraph to each movie or something. But the real breakthroughs were a couple more books. The two that I always cite are Cult Movies by Danny Peary
All three.
and 1, 2, and 3, and Midnight Movies by Jay Hoberman and Jonathan Rosenbaum.
All of those are in my
And
bookcase right here. Yes.
those are such wonderful books. Uh, my copy of Cult Movies is just beat all to hell because it was just, it was my go-to thing. I couldn't live without it. And in both of those books, both the Peary's books and Midnight Movies, they talked about Ed Wood in greater detail and all the strange things in his movies. And I couldn't imagine what these movies could possibly be like. So the real breakthrough was in around 1992, just pure luck. I happened to live near a city called Flint, Michigan,
Hmm.
and there was an Ed Wood movie marathon in Flint,
Oh,
Michigan.
that'd be great.
And that was the first time I saw 4 of his movies. They showed Glen or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and Night of the Ghouls.
That's the 4 best, I think.
Yeah, so and I stayed all through it. And I've said many times that, and they held these for a couple of years in a row, and I would attend every year. And I noted that Night of the Ghouls at first was used the room clearer. It was the one that you showed at the end of the night to get people to leave. And I was such a maniac that I stayed through the whole thing. And I would say that the scenes that really drove people out of the theater were the seance scenes where, you have the, all that happening in the film. And every time there would be a seance scene, and there are many in the movie, and they kind of go on and on, you'd hear people in the audience just get up and like, I can't take it, and they would go out. But I would be like, yes, show
I
me
love
more.
those too. I love those scenes. They're just
So,
wonderful.
yeah, so at that time, I was still in high school when they started, and there was a few, and I wrote about it. Before I ever saw any of the movies, I was so excited about the prospect of
Mhm.
the film festival that I wrote like a 2-page article about Ed Wood and his movies before having seen any of them. I hadn't seen a frame of his movies at this
Wow.
point. And you can find that on my blog somewhere. I wrote a whole thing about, I wrote a little retrospective about it. I think the article is called Scare Tactics.
I'll look for
And
it.
So you can see, like, I was like 17 years old, I think, and I was writing for the first time about Ed Wood, and I wrote like a 2-page feature article about Ed and his movies. And then I went to this festival, and the movies went beyond my expectations. They were better than what I was hoping for. So that was how I that was how I became sort of an Ed Wood fanatic. I say that I've been chasing that high from that night for 30 years.
And it's
So
amazing with your site and others is we keep finding new things about Ed Wood. I
well,
remember I remember cheering when they found Final Curtain. By the way,
yeah,
the first time I ever saw an Ed Wood movie was on Movies Till Dawn in 1982 on, I believe it was Channel 13 in Los Angeles, and I have that now on DVR. So
well,
it's fun to
that's
watch the used car commercials.
oh yeah, I love seeing
This is my
old
son Joe
broadcasts.
Gibson. He's here now,
Hi, Joe.
and get yourself mic'd up. I We'll start talking about the book, and we'll get back to Ed Wood. All right.
Sure.
The book is called Dad Made Dirty Movies, and I wrote a review. I've read it a couple of times and really enjoy it. But it's about a man named Stephen Apostolof,
Yeah, that's right.
and this is Ed Wood in the second stage of his career. Okay,
Yeah.
he's no longer making. I mean, you can argue whether Sinister Urge is a mainstream film or not, but he's
I
no
would argue that
longer
it is.
making these anymore. And he meets this guy Apostolof, who my wife is a Hungarian dissident who came to the United States with
Okay.
her family. So when I watched Journey to Freedom, I'm
Oh
thinking
yes.
I kind of
The
understand the
the
story
documentary accurate Journey to Freedom, which
with
tells
with
the
Tor Johnson.
with Tor Johnson, which tells the very, very accurate story of Steve's own exodus from Bulgaria. He he leapfrogged from Bulgaria to Istanbul to Paris to Canada, and then he went to Hollywood from there.
He
And
was living on the beach in Europe,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So when he got to Hollywood, he just decided basically, he said, in Wisconsin, you make cheese, in Detroit, you make cars, in Hollywood, you make movies. So he just decided to become a movie maker. He decided to become a film executive. And he really styled himself as an old time movie
Howard Hawks or
mogul.
something.
Well, yeah, he would smoke big cigars, and he would wear, he'd wear sunglasses, and he would drive around in big cars with like a license plate that said executive filmmaker on it. And he was living like, I don't think, he would use the profits, the usually meager profits from one film to finance the next one. And so uh, that's how he made it through the 60s and 70s. And he didn't really start out in adult films and softcore. I think he, you know,
Well,
made.
didn't he go bankrupt after Republic bought his movie?
Well, he was always sort of on the verge of bankruptcy. He was always sort of on the verge of bankruptcy. So uh, he realized that in the 1960s, maybe dramas and westerns and mystery films that maybe he wanted to make weren't going to be profitable for him. He wanted to make. Um, he decided that the quickest way to turn a profit on films would be to make adult films, to make softcore films. So really, his first entry into that world was Orgy of the Dead, which Ed wrote.
And I love the scene where he gives Ed a check for like $500, and Ed
Yes.
dances in the office in Glee for it, right?
Well, yes. Eddie just went through money like crazy, and
Yeah.
Eddie always needed money for a few things, uh, mainly alcohol. He was just a prodigious alcoholic, and so secondarily, rent or pay. He lost some houses along the way. Um, he and Dolores would live in a house, and he would lose that, and then he and Kathy would live in a house, and he would lose that, and he was sort of moving down and down and down in the real estate world until he was living in a hovel of an apartment. But the number one priority was always alcohol. So, um, you know, his Ed's wife Kathy always discouraged him from working with Steve
Yeah, she didn't
because
like him. In fact, you write in the book that she may have not told Steve where his funeral was, right?
right. So she continued to dislike him. Um, I think because she always thought that uh, Ed's writing career, which was super prolific, incredibly prolific,
Incredibly prolific.
was the most reliable source of money, and that Ed still trying to keep a foot in the movie business was sort of folly. It was sort of time wasting folly, when in the time that he was working on these movies, he could have probably written 10 or 11 novels in that time and made more money from it. Um, so she always thought that working on the Apostoloff films were a waste of time for Ed. But I think for Ed it was important because it was Ed's way of feeling like I'm still part of the movie industry.
I, I think you're right. They
So
had a falling out because I think in your book you write that Ed took some stills or something
he
from.
did. He did. Well, that was continual. That was a continual argument between Ed and Steve, but they made up from that one.
Yeah, they
Um,
did. They did.
so
Go
the
on. I'm
thing
sorry.
the thing is that Ed and Steve had a number of falling outs, and in fact there's like a 7-year gap between their first collaboration and their second. It's just because I think Ed was likable in some sense. He was kind of an affable guy and fun to hang out with. But I think he could also be a real headache to work with because mainly because of the drinking
And unreliability, right?
and
Things like that.
unreliability.
Yeah.
So, there's of course the story of Steve sending Ed out to buy food for the crew and the cast and crew. And Ed, of course, comes back with all alcohol and a bag of pretzels. And and Steve is like, "Where's the food, Eddie? Where's the food?" And he holds up the bag of pretzels. Here's the food. So uh, I think in a lot of ways, even as Eddie progressed further and further into alcoholism, uh, Steve kind of hiring him is over and over again, and into Ed's last year being alive, which is 1978. Steve tried to use him on the what's considered Ed's last movie, Hot Ice, from 1978, and I don't know exactly what Ed did on that film. There's been talk that Ed was supposed to have played some kind of part in it, which he doesn't. Um,
Well, apparently he came and started crying to Steve, right? According to
yes.
your book.
So
Yeah.
so then after Ed died, um, I think Steve felt really bad about it, but I think Steve is just one of those people who, kind of like Dolores Fuller, uh, stuck with it, stuck with Ed for as long as they
He
could,
could. Okay.
and that's the story of a lot of people. And you see,
Can
you
I
see,
ask? Can I ask you a quick question? I
sure,
want to.
go ahead.
And then Joe has a question coming up. But what do you think is the best Apostoloff movie? I would say probably Fugitive Girls,
Yeah,
because I like seeing Ed in those movies, and it seems to be something that had been a little bit better. American Independent or Crown might have picked it
yeah.
up.
I would say that if I used to say that if people were just dipping a toe into the Apostolov films, um, Fugitive Girls is probably the best place to start because it at least has kind of a semblance of action and a plot and things like that. And a lot of the Apostolov films, they sort of just get to be
Well, they start out with
they're
big boobs. Okay.
sure, but if you really want a movie, if you really want a director who can give you that, I mean, Russ Meyer can
I
do
should do
better.
better. Yeah.
Meyer can do better. Um, Steve's term for breasts was ticket sellers. He would call
Yeah, I
them.
remember reading that in the book.
So we call them ticket sellers. So, uh, and you have to remember that when he started in the 1960s, uh, you really had to be careful about what you could show and not show. So he could show bare breasts, but you couldn't show
Yeah,
full
you
frontal.
couldn't show. Yeah,
So,
and once
so
again, Hollywood took that away eventually from him.
well, yeah, as sex and nudity became much more mainstream, and then for a while, um, hardcore even went mainstream,
Yeah, for a
and
brief while. Yeah.
so and Steve had a very low opinion of hardcore, although I would have to say that in some of the raunchier of the Apostolov films, it's a game of inches here, really, between softcore and hardcore. It's really a matter of where the actors, from
Yeah.
what camera angle you see them from, because there are moments in films like Dropout Wife where I'm like,
Yeah,
okay,
I watched.
technically,
I watched my co-blogger Steve Stones has the big box or something it's called.
a big box of
Yeah,
wood,
and
yeah.
I've seen some parts of some of those movies. You might be right about that one. I
They
want to
get,
break. Oh, go on,
go
go
ahead.
on, go on.
Well, they get very, very close. Was
Yeah,
what I'm saying is that the 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 level of plausible deniability here for this just being softcore rather than hardcore, the line is very blurry. So
well, but then he wanted to do everything with hot ice. He wanted to break into the mainstream with hot ice. He
yeah,
lost his shirt, right?
he
Uh,
did. That was really the film that ended his film career because
I watched that
he.
movie.
Well, I've watched it a number of times. When I was working on Dad Made Dirty Movies, available at Amazon and wherever books exist. Um, I had to sort of live in the world of the Apostolov movies for like 5 years. And in a weird way, you mentioned, I think earlier that I do a Happy Days podcast. Um, in a weird way, like Happy Days has become part of my like daily life. I have to think about the characters of Happy Days kind of every week. Like, oh, what's Fonzie and Ralph and Richie doing? What are they doing this week? And I have to, and knowing the sets and the characters and all the tropes of that show, and that just becomes part of my daily life. Well, it was the same way when I was writing the Apostolov books. I had to live in this world of the Stephen Apostolov movies, which if you watch now, some of the more fun ones include like Lady Godiva Rides
I've
Again.
never seen that one. I don't
Well,
think.
that's not an Ed Wood movie, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But if you watch some of the Ed Wood, Steve Apostolov collaborations, things like the Class Reunion and uh, Cocktail Hostesses.
Yeah.
These films are kind of dreary in a way. There's like what I would call listless orgies where everyone's bored, or
And they're like in
orgies where
hotels, drab
they're in
hotels, right?
hotels,
Yeah,
and
things
a
like
lot
that.
of places a lot of times Steve liked to film in these sound stages where you can see like the acoustic panels on the walls
Yeah.
behind them, and he'll try to dress it up by like putting like a poster over it or something. But the rooms are very grim looking, and it looks like they're shot in a Soviet gulag. And there's these characters they're trying to have sex on like a bad looking couch. And there's like a skiing poster or something up on the wall that's supposed to make you think that this is like somebody's apartment or
Well,
hotel
even in
room.
Hot Ice, it's a little bit like that, although it's not pornographic, where it's these living rooms and things and hotel rooms, and they have like '70s stuff behind them. And I keep thinking that the skiing in that movie seems like it comes from a
Well,
family home movie or something, you know.
well, Steve did two movies about skiing, and he did them because his family just liked to go on ski trips to Mammoth Mountain in California. And he thought, well, two birds with one stone. We'll take the family up to the mountains, we'll do
Well,
some
that's
skiing,
low
and
budget filmmaking.
yeah, he knew some of the business owners up there, and they
So
would allow him to film in the ski lodges and the parking lots and the restaurants. And The one thing I was never able to quite determine, I don't think he did, was he made two of these movies that take place up in the mountains. Um, did he ever take Ed Wood up there? Because I don't know how Ed's alcoholism and the high altitude would have meshed. If you're up there, if you're really getting the whirlies, and you're
I
up there,
I get the feeling Ed Wood probably stayed at home. I
I
don't
would
know.
say so. I would
Hey, I
say
want to I
I would
want to circle it back to a
go
little
ahead.
bit. We'll go back to the book, I promise. Joe, you want to talk about the Ed Wood the movie, all right, with
Sure,
Johnny Depp?
please.
Ask this question for us. Okay,
Yeah,
you're telling me.
mainly I just wanted to ask if you think that, despite maybe not being the most accurate thing, that the Johnny Depp Ed Wood, was it still a good thing to have and to make?
I love the movie.
So do I.
I so I don't really care that it is not accurate. I always say that it's kind of the way Ed wished it were. A lot of it is kind of the way he wished it were. And I think like the supreme example of that in the whole movie is just the title sequence, which I think is one of the best parts of the movie,
Oh
where
yeah.
the title sequence looks the way I think Ed wishes the movies looked. Like there's a part where there's a stop motion tentacle that comes out of the water. And I think like, oh, that's probably what Ed wanted. Well, I think what he's done is he's given um, they've given Tim Burton and the screenwriters Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, they've given a sort of a glamour to the Ed Wood story that maybe it didn't have, and a grandeur to it. Um, One of the first things that you see Ed doing in the movie is putting on this play, The Casual Company. And that play that you see in the movie is completely written by Scott and Larry. It has nothing to do with The Casual Company at all.
You're right.
But I think what they came up with is kind of better than The Casual Company that really did exist. So it doesn't really bother me that I guess it bothers some people that the movie is not very accurate, but I think it puts the best possible spin on it, and I think it plays down a lot of the ugly, sort of the uglier parts of the story. Only a few times in the movie do you see Ed drinking. There's one time when he does go into a bar and he orders imperial whiskey, which I think was kind of the
That
main.
was the inside joke.
Yeah, imperial whiskey, but he goes in there fully in drag and says, "Imperial whiskey, please." And I was thinking, well, in real life, imperial whiskey especially did terrible things to Ed.
People.
So I've often said, I'll tell this story again. I think that the time to make Ed Wood 2 is right now,
It should be
and
made. You know.
and the person who should star in it is still Johnny Depp, because if you've
Oh,
seen
that's
Johnny
a.
Depp,
You
if
know
you've
that's a
seen
good. We may end up doing a short of what you just said. Okay.
because if you've seen Johnny Depp in 2024, he looks like Ed Wood from the 1970s. That's what he
That's a
looks like
very
now.
good point. Hey,
So
I want to ask
go
you
ahead.
one more thing. I remember I didn't mention this, but I got a recharge from the Golden Turkey books,
Oh
which are
yes,
now controversial. Joe had a question about the Golden Turkey books,
sure,
and the way that the Ed Wood was sort of laughed at.
sure.
You go ahead and say it.
Well, just basically that. I mean,
Did it help? You know.
he was laughed at. Did it help? Was it fair? All those things.
The thing is, um, oftentimes, Harry and Michael Medved are often made to be the villains sometimes of the Ed Wood story, and things get a little muddied because Michael Medved later went on to be quite controversial politically. He became quite a right-wing pundit who would go on Fox News and all this, and so that sort of muddied the waters a little bit because now there's this Fox News guy, and then that gets added to the story. But at the time, you have to know that Harry and Michael Medved had no idea who Ed Wood was when they
Yeah.
started writing the Golden Turkey Awards. Ed Wood and Plan 9 came to them from readers. readers of their previous book, which was I think called like the 50 Worst Films of All Time.
I have that. That was the first
Yeah,
book I read about this kind of stuff, cult films.
yeah, that was a film. That was a book that I read in college, and of course, that's the one with the infamous Dog of Norway chapter.
No,
If you
no,
watch,
that's not in 50 Worst Films.
is it 50 Worst Film?
It's
I
in
thought it was.
it's in the Golden Turkey, I think.
It's in Golden. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
the one that's the fake one. One of the movies is fake. So, but it's been a long time since. Well, 50 Worst Films even has some strange choices. I mean, it has. I think last year, Marion Bad. I think it's
Ivan the Terrible's in there.
Ivan the Terrible's in it. So, they make some bold choices, but it was readers who brought them Ed Wood and who brought them.
Yeah, I even sent in a
Plan9.
vote back then.
Oh, so maybe you were part of the problem.
Look, I was a teenager. No, I was a teenager at those times, and I'd go down to B. Dalton Pickwick and buy these books, and they were superb. I still own them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's you. This is very coincidental. You're mentioning B. Dalton. So my next Ed Wood Wednesdays article, which should come out in a few days, is going to be a little bit about the role of bookstores like B. Dalton in my own journey as an Ed Wood fan. So that's kind of coming up. But I think that Ed was always eager for any attention that he could get. I think the fact that the movies got any attention whatsoever would have pleased him. Ultimately, I don't think Ed, there's often the idea that Ed was this very self-serious guy who took himself to be a genius and all this. I don't really see a heck of a lot of evidence to support that. And you also have to remember that the Golden Turkey Awards is basically, the equivalent of those first maps of the New World. When you see those maps of the New World that they were drawing, and you're like, well, it's very crude and the proportions are all wrong. Well, they're like the first people making the map. And then, 10 years later, 12 years later, actually, is when Nightmare of Ecstasy comes out. And then that's a more accurate map. And so, and the view has only gotten more accurate since then as more details have gotten filled in. I think that the Golden Turkey Awards I try not to villainize them. I try not to demonize that book. Just because it helped keep the films alive, it helped get the films out there. It's likely that a lot of the reissues that were starting to happen wouldn't have happened without that book. So I have mixed feelings about it, I guess now. Although I must say that I've only interacted with him a little bit, but Harry Medved is a very nice guy. He's not a hateful guy at all. He's much more sincere in his film fandom.
Was it you or Bob who wrote that Harry's done a lot for the industry? I read somewhere, maybe on the Ed Wood Facebook page.
Probably that would have been Bob. I think Harry and Bob know each other to some extent. And the great thing about Bob, of course, is that he's right there in Los Angeles, and he can visit all these places, and he can give us. I want to say that recently Harry visited the site of Quality Studios, the place, the studio where
they filmed Plan9, right?
Plan9 was filmed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Harry emailed me about it, and I'm sorry to say, boy, I don't know. I've not been to Los Angeles since I was a small child, and I was there with my family, and we certainly weren't visiting Ed Wood locations at the time. We saw like some of the walk game, and we saw some of the famous stuff.
It's still there. And even that, apparently there was like a little bar around the corner there that might even still be there. I want to circle back to Apostolof now, if you don't mind.
Please do.
The book is a family biography also.
Yes, it is.
And and his kids are very candid about, my dad made these dirty movies, but and we were a
Well,
family and everything. And he married a much younger woman, Shelley, right, at one point.
he did. That's his third and final wife. The one who stuck with him was Shelley, and
And
he had one child with Shelley, Chris.
mm-hmm.
Um, I really can't say enough about the Apostolov family. They were extremely open, extremely candid. They were extremely generous about sharing the archives. One wonderful thing is that Steve was kind of a self-archivist. He saved the photographs, he saved the old scripts, you know, and those were invaluable. God, he saved the contracts.
You got some of those scripts I see on the Ed Wood page. They have to make them into a book so I can buy them. All right.
Okay, that book is in the planning stage. I
Good.
can't
Good.
say that. I can't say that. The For some reason, I don't know why this tripped a wire in my brain, but the script that I want to get out there is the script for the basketballers.
Yeah, I
He,
remember reading about
Eddie,
that.
I wrote an article about it. I still haven't read the whole script of the basketballers, but basically, I wanted to do a book of the Wood Apostolov scripts that had not been filmed. I wanted to do. I was very much inspired by, if you've seen the books, the scripts from the Crypt.
Oh, I
Books.
have most of those. Yes.
The scripts from the Crypt books are incredible.
And I'm waiting for the Night of the Ghouls one to come out for like 2 years now. When's it going
Is
to come
there
out?
one? Okay, because I know of two of them that are Ed Wood ones, and they are
Own them both.
they are incredibly detailed and just rich with detail,
Bard of the Monster and the Lost Ed Wood screenplay.
and the lost ones. So
Yeah.
I wanted to do something in that nature, in that vein, for the unmade Apostolov films.
Have you checked with the publisher?
Well, okay, I've mainly been negotiating this with Bob, because I think so. Bob is the one. Bob is really the one who's gotten most of the stuff published. This is my stand. Now, the thing that you have to understand is that writing a book like that, this book took 5 years, and I used to say that if I made $500 from 5 years of work, I would have been happy. And I didn't realize at the time that was so over ambitious. I don't even want to tell you that $500.
I know the feeling. Yeah.
So what I got with my royalties from Dad Made Dirty Movies were laundry tokens to use in the apartment building where I live. So my standard line about the book is that writing a book about dirty movies helped keep my laundry clean. So I got clean from writing about dirty movies, and that was literally it. So the thing that I would have to do, well, the good thing about writing the book was that at the time I was trying to make it as a freelance writer, and I was doing a lot of freelance writing for websites and things, which meant that I had lots of downtime and lots of time to sort of lavish on this book. And I spent many hours with the manuscript of Dad Made Dirty Movies. And for some reason, my ritual while working on that book was listening to albums by Ravi Shankar. So I should have thanked Ravi Shankar in the acknowledgments in this book, because that was a big part of the writing process. I would listen to these. He put out these beautiful albums of these like sort of long instrumental albums of raga music, and I would listen to that. Well, it would put me sort of in the 60s sort of mindset, and so now if I were to work on a book like the proposed Apostolov script book, I don't know what kind of publisher we could find for it. Generally, the reason why the publisher that we chose, McFarlane, was purely a whim on my case. One of the first Ed Wood books that I read outside of Nightmare of Ecstasy was a book called Ed Wood Mad Genius by Rob Craig.
Rob Craig and I have become friends recently. I've talked to him a bit.
I love that book,
I do
and
too.
I only very recently got a physical copy of it. I only had an ebook of it, and now I have a physical copy of it that I keep on my nightstand. It's a nice bedtime reading, I guess. And I was so enamored of that book that when Jordan came to me, Jordan Todorov, the co-author of Dad Made Dirty Movies, came to me and wanted to know about a publisher. Um, my first thought was, oh, it's got to go to McFarlane. I wanted to be published by the same company that put out Ed Wood, Mad Genius. Well, in recent years, Bob has put out 3 different collections of Ed Wood stories and articles, and these are such wonderful things. I think they've come out from 3 different
Well, the
three
first
different
one was from a
publishers.
different publisher. Then Bear Manor did some, right?
Yeah, it was like the first one was OR Books, and I don't know who put out the second one. And then the third one was Bear Manor.
right?
Bear Manor put out the most recent one.
Yeah.
So I think Bear Manor it would probably take an Apostolof book. I don't know that I could interest. I don't know that I could interest McFarlane in another. I don't have anything against them. They put out. I mean, I'm happy with the way the book looks and things like that.
I got to tell you, I would love to see that. And this and 25 cents will get you a gumball, but I would love to see a movie adaptation of Dad Made Dirty Movies.
Oh, I mean, I would too. So the thing is, I have, I'll tell you, my most satisfying aspect of writing the book came well after writing the book. Was Jordan sent me a box of books and said, would you mail them out to people who had either given us blurbs or who had agreed to be interviewed? And I said, okay, I would do that. That turned out to be more expensive than I had expected, but because I don't know, the book is kind of heavy.
Yeah.
So, but one of the people that I sent it to was the actress who played the slave dancer in Orgy of the Dead. And she sent me a lovely back and a handwritten note. And that was such a touching thing because she was like, oh, thank you for sending me this and thank you for writing this book. And so that was a great experience. That was one of the most satisfying.
And that's something you're doing that's really good. Like I found it fascinating to learn about Fawn Silver in the book, all right? And I find it fascinating to learn about people like Dr. T.K. Peters or Major J.C. Foxworthy. You do that in your blog and things like that. There's just amazing to me.
Well, one of my other standard comments about this is like what keeps me in the Ed Wood fandom. It's the same thing that keeps people in like Star Wars or Star Trek fandom or Marvel or DC fandom or Tolkien fandom. It's a whole universe with different characters, and it's a very fully furnished, fully populated universe of all this different. I will never come close to running out of things to write about because
I agree with you on that.
I have hundreds of articles ahead of me. So because you just never can run out of stuff. I realize, one of the articles that I've been putting off writing, but I'll have to write it someday, is the article about, I was just thinking about this earlier today, was the article about Joanna Lee, who played Tana in Plan 9 from Outer Space. And then over the years, grew very, very weary of people asking her about Plan 9 from Outer Space. And by the end of her life was quite bitter about it. And I think that Joanna Lee probably worked with Ed Wood for a couple of days in 1956. She was probably an actress who responded to an ad or something. worked for a couple of days, got paid a very small amount, and then went on with her life.
Was
Well,
she the mayor of Hollywood at one point?
no, well, she was quite a successful television writer,
Okay.
and in the 60s and 70s, and she had all these career accomplishments of her own. She gave up acting and went into writing, and she became quite a successful television writer. And I think over the years, she became very, very bitter that people kept asking her about this stupid science fiction film that she'd made in
You
1956.
should do it. Isn't that?
So,
But she achieved an enduring fame because of that.
but I think she felt over the years like this is overshadowing the work that I actually want to be
Ah,
remembered
okay,
for, which
okay.
is like, because some of her, some of her made for television movie scripts were quite acclaimed and were about serious issues. And she's like, I think she grew very, very resentful about being asked about this movie that she'd made, when she was a young woman. She was like just in her 20s or something. And she showed up for a couple of days to work at this crummy studio. And uh, she didn't think that this film would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, some of the actors, like Gregory Walcott, eventually got a good
Yeah,
sense of
they did.
humor about it. He would eventually learn to roll with the punches. Um, but Joanna never did, and it really became a problem for her.
Yeah, you
And
should write
so
about that. That'd be interesting.
when she wrote her own autobiography, she just does a blistering attack on Ed and the film, and she's just really, really negative. And you can just see how, like, I just think how decades of being asked about this at like in interviews had just broken her spirit over the time, because she had a whole life. I mean, she had drama in her own life. She had ups and downs, and had a story worth telling. And I wonder how she felt when her autobiography came out, that one of the things on the cover was a picture of her as
Really?
Anna.
I'm sorry, you're
On
going to be Miss Lee. You're going to be Tana to me forever. That's the thing.
so
Although she's pretty good in this movie with Leonard Nimoy. Also, what's it called again?
I've not
Brain
seen her
Eaters
in
or
a movie.
something. She was in the.
Well, I'm obsessed with her coworker, Dudley Manlove.
He's great.
So every time I get to see or hear Dudley in something else, it's always a treat. He's in one of the strangest movies I've ever seen, which is called Creation of the Humanoids.
Yes.
That's a truly bizarre film. And he was a radio announcer as well. And I really recommend, if people want to hear the dulcet tones of Dudley Manlove, check out a radio show called Candy Matson, about a female private eye.
How do you spell Matson? Is it M-A?
Matson, I think, is Candy
Okay.
Matson.
I want to get a couple of quick questions to you.
Quick
because
questions before I gotta go.
Yeah. First one is, do you think that the scene in Fugitive Girls where they attack a man in a wheelchair is channeling that British film A Clockwork Orange?
I wrote all about that.
I know. I wanted to have you talk about that.
Okay, there is a scene where there's a home invasion. The fugitive girls do a home invasion. They terrorize the people in the house. The guy's in a wheelchair. It's very, very similar to A Clockwork Orange. And on the commentary track on the DVD of it, one of the commentary tracks that's been recorded for that film, the commentators suggest how ridiculous it would be to think that Ed would be aware of A Clockwork Orange, or would want to reference that in one of his own films. But what you have to realize is a couple of things. Number one, Clockwork Orange was not an obscure art film. It was one of the top 10 grossing films of its year. It was like one of the top 10 grossing films of 1971. It was everywhere. It made the cover of Mad magazine. Alfred E. Newman is Alex on the cover of Mad. And you can see that in the opening credits of Mad TV. And if you ever watched the Mad TV sketch show, you'd see like little glimpse of Alex, the Droog, with Alfred E. Newman's face. So I think Ed very much was keeping tabs on the entertainment industry. He definitely would have been aware of A Clockwork Orange. And yeah, I think it's very possible that he was referencing that. So
Okay. And
it's
one quick, I know we're almost out of time here. someday I'd like you to do something on what was Don Nagel doing as assistant director in Take It Out and Trade. He's not even listed at IMDb.com, but he's on the credits. That interests me.
Well, Don Nagel is one of these shadowy figures. He worked with both Ed Wood and Steve Apostolof.
Suburbia Confidential.
Yes, and we have some stories about Don apparently flexing his muscles a little too much and trying to boss Steve around, which Steve wouldn't allow anyone to do. So Don is one of these kind of shadowy figures in the Ed Wood world. He's in some of the Ed Wood movies. He acts in some of them.
Yeah.
He's behind the scenes in some of the films, and yet I have not done a deep dive into the life of Don Nagel, other than what you can read in Dad Made Dirty Movies, available at Amazon.
And that's why I brought those up, because I know they're in the book. The book is, Dad, it's a wonderful book. You can get it at Amazon. And I do hope to see The Basketballers come out sometime.
I do too.
You need to go to Svengoolie, I know that. And I wish that we could talk for 2 more hours. Maybe we will sometime. Joe, thank you very much.
I'd be happy to do it again.
For this. And Joe is here. And Steve Stones, who couldn't be here, wants to say hi to you. He's a co-blogger.
Hi, Steve.
We're at Plan9Crunch on YouTube, Plan9Crunch on Facebook, Plan9Crunch.blogspot.com. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for writing a wonderful book, and thank you for all you do. And that's a wrap.
All right.